So, after the Mexican-American War, the United States will acquire a great deal of territory. And with the discovery of gold in California, there will be this flood of individuals of the region. They had so many individuals over there, it was easy to see that they were going to apply for statehood. The question that comes into play will be whether or not California will be a slave state or a free state. Again, whenever you acquire this amount of territory, or I should say, if Americans are moving westward, the issues of slavery will travel with them. A debate will take place in Congress because they don't want it to turn into another Missouri Compromise situation where it was obvious that the anti-slavery forces got the better end of the deal with more territory that would be against slavery or not allowing slavery up north. When it was all said and done, a compromise will be developed because many southern states were arguing that they were going to secede from the Union if California came in as a free state. So three individuals will produce a compromise. These individuals are Henry Clay, and he is right here. If you recall, he's the guy who organized the Missouri Compromise, and he's also involved in settling the nullification crisis. Then we have John C. Calhoun, who was the vice president, Andrew Jackson, during the nullification crisis, and he's from South Carolina. And then we have Daniel Webster here. Now, what exactly takes place in this Compromise of 1850? And I'm going to want you guys to underline that, make sure you are aware of this term here. I'm underlining it now. And there are many parts. Number one, California will enter the United States as a free state. Number two, the slave trade will be outlawed in Washington, D.C. Number three, the territories of New Mexico and Utah, unsettled regions within the Mexican Cession, slavery will be allowed in those regions based on popular sovereignty. And so what that practically means is the people are going to have the power to vote, because that's what popular sovereignty implies. It means the power, or I should say the rule of the people. So these are, let's see, there's 1, 2, 3 items so far. And then last but not least, we have something called the Fugitive Slave Law. And really, we've always had fugitive slave laws. This one just happens to be harsher. So that would be number 4. All of these are the components of this compromise. Now, if you look at the first 3 components, those seem to be in favor with the abolitionist movement, the anti-slavery cause. The 4th bullet seems to be more in favor and supportive of the pro-slavery southern states. The new fugitive slave law argued that fleeing slaves could no longer testify nor receive a trial jury. It doesn't matter where they happen to be captured or end up in a free state or not. As long as you are south of the Canadian border, you will be considered a runaway slave, and you'll forever live like that. Also, Northerners, whether you like it or not, if federal officials or individuals are in pursuit of a runaway slave, you are required by law to assist if they ask you to. Failure to do so can result in being fined or jailed. And this fugitive slave law practically means that, as far as we can see it, slavery, if you're a black person and unless you have papers, you could be considered a runaway slave and therefore captured and returned to that status of slavery. As long as you're within the American borders, that's going to be the situation. Now, why is the compromise significant? Why is the Compromise of 1850 so important? Well, much like the Missouri Compromise, it will, for the time, settle the issue of slavery in the Mexican Cession. And I'm going to use a blue marker of sorts to kind of highlight this Mexican Cession here. Right, so we've settled slavery in that region. It's open to popular sovereignty. Whereas slavery in the Missouri Compromise is still under this arbitrary notion that anything north of this 3630 parallel, that area, and I'm marking it in red right now, this area is open or I'm sorry, slavery is not allowed in that region. So that's the compromise, and now we can move forward. At this time, go ahead and underline Dred Scott v. Sanford. This is a Supreme Court case in which Dred Scott, his wife, and child are traveling with their master, and they happen to be traveling in an area where it's free, and the master suddenly, out of nowhere, dies. Dred Scott's looking at his wife looking at Dred Scott, and they're thinking, well, hey, we're free. Let's live it up while we can. And, you know, people knew of them. They were aware of them. They were conducting business on behalf of and with their slave master. So why not stay there? And that's exactly what they do. For the next 5 years, they will be residing in a free state and seeing themselves as free with no problems or qualms. Well, eventually, they travel back to Missouri, and word comes around that Dred Scott, the heir to his master's estate, which would have been the wife and the eldest son, they want all their property of that state, these slaves included. So lawsuits begin to be filed so that they can reclaim this property. They're making the argument that, no, we've been living freely for so many years. It doesn't fall under this jurisdiction, doesn't fall under that jurisdiction, until it finally makes its way to the Supreme Court. And that's when the Supreme Court will make the argument that because a slave was private property, he can be taken into any territory, free or not, and legally held there in a state of slavery. And this is a major blow to the abolitionist cause, because now we are looking at slaves as property. The Supreme Court of the United States, which is one of the few federal branches of government under the jurisdiction of the U.S. Constitution, they are openly identifying slaves as property. Now, don't get me wrong, we've had numerous people and various agencies or states argue that slaves were property, but never have we had it formalized, canonized by way of a Supreme Court case under again, with the support of the U.S. Constitution. So this happens to be a landmark case in favor of the pro-slavery forces of the South, and that starts to cause not panic, but it definitely elevates the tension in America, because we're playing this game, this for that, if you will, and ultimately it's going to lead to some bloodshed. Please underline John Brown. John Brown is a religious man who, while in church, hears a very simple message that slavery was a sin. And he will dedicate the rest of his life to ensure that he does everything within his powers to bring about the abolishment of slavery. He will ultimately become an old man, and despite many efforts, slavery is still around. So he says, you know what, I've had enough. He tells his 3 boys to get up. He gathers up some other runaway slaves, and they ultimately devise a plan to raid a arsenal in a local fort called Harper's Ferry, raid that ferry of weapons, give those weapons to black people so that they can launch a large-scale rebellion producing a black free state. John Brown's a white guy. His sons are white, and they are willing to take up arms to end slavery or bring about a slave revolution in America. They will be caught. The sons will be killed. John Brown will be caught, is what I should say. And he'll be charged and tried and found guilty. He will be executed, and much of America is torn on this issue. Half of America looks at him as a madman. The other half of America looks at him as a martyr. A madman because he's willing to take up arms to because he has the conviction to end slavery in that capacity. You have other individuals that would consider him a martyr because he is a white man who had no real investment or skin in the game of slavery, but nonetheless he was willing to risk his life and oddly enough risk his son's lives to end slavery. And now we see that white people are willing to fight, kill, and die to end slavery. This is how this story is going to go. John Brown, as an individual, is setting the stage for a showdown that there will be blood. Now, as to whether or not if you agree or disagree with John Brown, that's neither here nor there. It is a controversial step because we see that violence is escalating. Now, in the election of 1860, the Democratic Party is it. You have Southern Democrats that are going to nominate a guy by the name of Breckinridge. You have Northern Democrats who are nominating a man by the name of Douglas. Then we have another party that's called the Constitutional Union Party, consisting of Whigs and Know-Nothings. They were called the Know-Nothings because on the issue of slavery, they just rather not know anything about it. And they're going to nominate a guy by the name of Bell. And then last but not least, we're the Republican Party, who has kind of resurfaced, are going to nominate Abraham Lincoln. History tends to show that when a political party is split, especially if it's one of the major two, like the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, if that party happens to be split, it makes it so much easier for the other party to win. Now, who exactly is Abraham Lincoln and what exactly are Republicans and what are their positions? Well, the Republican platform is fairly inclusive. The number one item on their platform is the major sticking point for many Southerners. They can't stand the fact that the number one issue for the Republican Party is the non-extension of slavery for free soilers. So you don't have to underline that, but I'm definitely making this very clear that when Lincoln took office, or I should say when Lincoln ran for president under the Republican platform, this is what ultimately jolted Southerners to say, oh, no, 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 no. We can't have this guy be president. If he becomes the president, then this country is going to split in half between anti-slavery and pro-slavery forces. Now, the reason why Lincoln will become president is not simply because he's against the extension of slavery. It's also because he's willing to promote businesses with a protected tariff. He's interested in internal improvements for many people manifesting themselves westward and northwest. He is in favor of homesteads for farmers who settle out in an area, and if they happen to work it up for 5 years, then they can claim that as theirs for free. We have protective rights for immigrants. And so with all these items combined, the Republican platform is going to be very appealing. It's inclusive, and Southerners are absolutely against it. When you look at the election results of 1860, Lincoln will definitely win the popular vote overwhelmingly. You can see here he's at 40%. We'll clear that out. And then and then he wins the electoral vote handedly, as you guys can see up here with 59%. Now, when you look at the United States geographically, the South tends to vote in unison for a very, very long time. And it almost looks like a 2016 election map. But anyways, you can see a lot of Southerners, they tend to vote a particular way. They have developed a lot of similar attitudes on things. But that's the situation. And much of the South is not doing well with an Abraham Lincoln presidency. So what do they decide to do? Months after Lincoln's election, 7 states from South Carolina to Texas will secede from the Union. Before he even takes office, they are calling themselves the Confederate States of America. They have adopted a constitution in which, in the constitution, they readily acknowledge slavery and readily acknowledge that it has to be an institution to be preserved for Southerners and their way of life. And then last but not least, they choose a president by the name of Jefferson Davis. The fact that all of this is able to take place before Lincoln even takes office should tell you that they were planning this all along. They just needed the right moment to act. this time I want you guys to underline Fort Sumter. This is a federal fort located in South Carolina, a state that had recently seceded from the Union. The soldiers at that fort are requesting supplies, resources. Lincoln, as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, is obligated to meet that request. South Carolina will make the argument that if any resources are sent to this fort, they will see that as a threat and they will fire upon the fort. Lincoln has now been threatened. Because if he fails to respond to his troops based on that threat, then he's not a person who should be in charge of the country or the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Secondly, if he does send the resources and he does his job, he's not itching for a war, but he understands that there could be, the possible consequence of conflict between the federal government and state governments. Lincoln will send the resources. South Carolina will fire on the fort. They're going to take the fort. Lincoln's going to send troops to get the fort back. When Lincoln sent troops, federal troops to South Carolina, this will anger 4 other southern states, and they too will join the Confederacy. That will consist of Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas. And ladies and gentlemen, we now have the Civil War, the American Civil War, and Fort Sumter is the spark that set it off. When you look at this slide here, you can see which states are involved initially with the Confederacy. It's these blue ones here. And then with the firing upon Fort Sumter and the sending of troops and whatnot, or the siege that takes place at Fort Sumter, we can see these gray states that will join the Union right here. I'm sorry, join the Confederacy. And then everything in red will be considered the Union. And then we also have these teal, I guess, bluish states. These light blue states right here. These are going to be considered border states. And we'll talk more about them when we get into the next chapter, the chapter on the American Civil War.